The more you give away, the bigger your status. The potlatch is a typical word we hear with Native American societies, kind of the same idea. And you can get control through again, skill. If you're the best warrior, then the other warriors are going to trust you more so they don't get killed. And putting yourself through a lot of physical trauma. The difference is athletes can keep preparing themselves in ways that you're looking 500 years ago, people couldn't prepare themselves that way. You blew an ACL or you blew a knee 1500, you weren't ever walking again. A group or a band, these, we talking about early tribes. Band is more of a better political thing. You're talking a dozen people, maybe 20, and that's your village, and you lose one of your best hunters. That's a major blow to the sustainability of your village.
Hi, this is Sifu Slim, author of The Aging Athlete. In this book, you're going to get to hear about two different groups of former high-performance athletes. One group, which is made up of 90% of the former athletes, does not do physical activity on a regular basis and tends to suffer the consequences of a sedentary lifestyle. The other group, which is made up of 10% of the former athletes, is doing physical activity on a regular basis and tends to thrive through the aging process, or at least has a better chance at coping with the aging process. We could have taken these folks to a lab and done all kinds of tests on them. Instead, we slowed them down and sat them down and asked them, in their own words, to describe why they're wired the way they are, so that we all, former athletes and non-athletes, can use some of their inspirational and motivational and mindset lessons in our own lives. I hope you pick up a copy today. You can go to theagingathlete.com. And when you have a chance to read it, I'd love to hear back from you to find out what your thoughts are on the stories of these aging athletes. Hi, this is Sifu Slim, and I am here in Santa Barbara, California. And I've been studying as an author on wellness, how tribal people have lived throughout the history of the records that one can find, archaeological records, etc. And I've been seeking out information on those types of things for the past 12 years. And I've had the occasion to bump into archaeologists and anthropologists, but I haven't had the excitement of interviewing one yet. So that's getting me jazzed at the moment to finally do that. So today I have Dr. Brent Leftwich, who got his PhD from UCSB, got his master's and his bachelor's from the University of North Carolina. And so today we're going to talk about some of these things that have been on my mind and how they impact you as a modern human being. So welcome, Dr. Brent.
Thank you.
So leftwicharchaeology.com, how long have you had that website?
The website's been up for about 4 years for the archaeology business. I went independent as my own company around 2012, and then finally moved up to the archaeologist. It was testing the waters, and as the business grew, I further developed the website. Before that, I worked for various other companies.
So to lighten the mood out there in the viewing audience, I put on a shirt that was the closest one I have to like a utility shirt that has different pockets and gizmos. So you could, if you were using something like a brush, you could actually put it in here. So I've got my handy dandy toothbrush. And then if you're in California or in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent, you'd want to have your hat and your covering and maybe some sunscreen on your face. So how am I doing as a starter? Those
are all very important things. I have the big floppy hat, and I've moved on to thrift store shirts for my field shirts these days. They don't last real long, but that's pretty par for the course.
What do you do for your elbows if you're down digging through things? You have some sort of a padding, or do you put something?
Well, the elbows never really are an issue. It's the knees. We do have like the same pads you use for gardening, those foam pads, and sometimes you use knee pads, but often it's more standing up in shovels a lot of times than it is, when you're on the ground doing the fine tune stuff, you're not down there super long.
So people study archaeology, and people who don't study that wonder what exactly it is. And so I looked it up on Wordnik, and it talks about studying past human life and culture by the recovery and examination of remaining material evidence, such as graves, buildings, tools, pottery, and it's classified under anthropology. What else would you like to add to that definition?
That is correct. The main misconception is we do not deal with dinosaurs. That's the question I get all the time. That is not us. The bare bones definition of archaeology, that's where the grass is that reconstructing past lifeways. And you do that through whatever means. And the main means is through the material culture and the things you just described, which usually is refuse. It's discarded things, but it's obviously only the things that preserve. A lot of the stuff that you mentioned, the stone, some bone, depending on your environment, and pottery and some monumental architecture if you're dealing with state level societies. But you're right, we're all anthropologists. Everybody's an anthropologist.
So we're looking at material remains to determine how they lived, what their culture was like. And these are ancient people. And now if you talk to someone who's in their teens now, someone from 1910, like their great-great-grandparents, they could be an ancient culture, living completely different lives than someone today who's got an iPhone for all the answers and does perhaps less in verbal communication. Maybe you could talk to us about what you've seen from your grandparents and great-grandparents to what people are doing today and how some of those things are impacting us as a culture.
Well, one thing to keep in mind too, from a legal definition, an archaeological site is anything over 50 years old. So, there's historic archaeologists, industrial archaeologists that all kind of go into that same thing. And looking at the cultural change, it's a good and a bad. And we have now more information at the tip of our fingers than any point in human history. The problem is there's no real gatekeepers of that information. What is real, what is not, what is opinion. There's no, the lack of truth checking is a big issue. Versus when you talk about information from our grandparents' age, it was Walter Cronkite, it was the news, it was the president. Those were people and voices you trusted. It was academics or clergy or whoever. So I think it is now more people have become their own individual keepers of information, keepers of what define them. And also there's definitely been a major shift in what defines culture. Versus you had a very much among anthropologists, among the greatest generation in the 20s and 40s, even early anthropology, it was the cultures defining it in terms of how things compare to Western culture. What's on a scale of that, you always, whatever culture you're in, you always kind of assume you're at the top worldwide. To now it being more of a cultural diverse, where at least from an academic standpoint and more into the popular culture, there's an appreciation of more backgrounds, more opinions, more views.
So if someone looks back at just a few generations ago and we consider some of their lifestyle daily tasks, picking up things, moving animals around, butchering chickens, picking potatoes, moving the potatoes upstairs, cleaning things with water that they had to cart in by hand and by cart from a well or from a distant water source. What are some of the things that taught that culture about not being sedentary? We've got two sedentaries. We've got a sedentary village, which people used to move a lot. And then we've got sedentary, like a grandma being in a hospital bed, or a wheelchair sedentary, or now kids with their iPhones not doing a whole lot of movement and maybe using their iPhone for their bus pass and not thinking about, paper and human interaction. So maybe you can talk to us, because my book, which I led with in my field of wellness, is called Sedentary Nation. And I was amazed at just, these people in 1910 that I show on the cover of my book, they're moving all the time. That's what they did. Even like an Ebenezer Scrooge from the 1800s and Dickens, he's walking to work and he's going to the market to pick up his his food, and he's walking to church on the weekend. So even an accountant back in the 1800s is doing a lot of movement.
That is true. And it's also important to think at times in scale. So we are comparing modern life with modern convenience of transportation and luxury versus, say, early industrial age, Dickens. But you also need to look at what was before the industrial age, 200 years before that. People in the 1800s, someone that was from 16, all these people are lazy. They have horses and cars to take them everywhere. They don't have to walk 20 miles for water. They have plows instead of people with hoes. So it is a scale. There is a certain disconnect. Most people don't think about where their food comes from versus it, we never had more food any point in history. But only a small fraction of us, less than 5% of Western culture is involved in agriculture, down from probably 1800, 75% or so that was in agriculture. You do have a more laborious life. There are definitely advantage to that in terms of exercise. There are a whole host of sedentism diseases with diabetes, heart disease, obesity. But you also got to keep in mind you had a whole host of diseases at that time too. Some of them a lot of repetitive stress disorders. You look at skeletal remains from farmers, and they're suffering tremendously from arthritis. They're suffering from all the diseases brought on by being in close contact with animals over and over. So it's a disconnect. It's like someone from the 1950s and their grandfather's like, you don't know how to blacksmith anymore. There's definitely a sliding scale. There is a push, and there's definitely an obesity epidemic in this country, but there's also not as much a malnutrition epidemic as you would have had in the 20s and 30s. Some kids do go to bed hungry in this country. It's still a problem, but it's not the scale it was during the Dust Bowl. So it's economies of scale, and I think every generation laments what the earlier generation forgot, or what the next generation forgot. And I think I'll be in that boat too with my kids, and so on and so on. But there is a need to reconnect to place, and I will agree with that we are wrapped up more in sort of a virtual world than a real world in a lot of ways.
Touching the earth is not only good for our mind and our connection with nature and artifacts from our past, it also does something to our system, the actual touching of the earth. So that would be like a neurobiological type of a thing that we're supposed to do. We've evolved to be, barefoot and at some point of the day, like a dog would be barefoot. And the book Born to Run talks about this, limited sole footwear, but even better is no footwear. If you don't have rocks and things that can cut your feet, if you're actually touching the earth, then you, for a long time, like 60 to 80 minutes, supposedly you get grounded, and then you have the same voltage in your body as the ground has. So those are things that are being looked into that the hunter-gatherers probably didn't even think about. They just got the wellness impacted them because they were living in a natural way, and they were learning from experience and from prior, like the tribal elders, what worked and what did in terms of their sustainability. Maybe you could share what you think about that.
That is true. So when you're dealing with hunter-gatherers, it is sort of, what you touched on in your introduction. It's like, what do we know and how do we know it? And what we know is limited, unfortunately. It is talking about the archaeological record. Archaeological record is only what is preserved. We can't, we extrapolate for decision-making and behaviors and that kind of stuff, but we only have a limited data set to work with. Or it's ethnography. It is people's studies, and particularly you think about the hunter-gatherer studies of people like the Aborigines in Australia, the Kalahari, and the people live in the polar regions who, they certainly separate themselves from the ground because of the environment. So most hunter-gatherer specialists fall into a theorist called behavioral ecology. Behavioral ecology is a main driver from an academic standpoint of understanding hunter-gatherers. And, as you said, we were all from hunter-gatherers. 90% of human history, all humanity were hunter-gatherers. But their decision, their behavior making, their health, their well-being was all based on how they adapted to the environment they're in. And one unfortunate thing is most of our ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherers are hunter-gatherers who exist on the margins, who exist in harsh climates, deserts, polar areas, dense forest and jungle, because farmers, industrialized societies push them out of the more desirable places. So we also sometimes get a skewed idea of the hunter-gatherer ethos or what they did, because we're dealing with small sample sizes. Now, getting kind of more back to that main question, are they more connected? They certainly are, because they have to be. It is a matter of survival. And we have this tendency, and something I brought up when I taught courses on this, to think of hunter-gatherers as two ways. We think of them as primitive, which I think was pre-1980. Most of the world saw these people living in dirt, no farming, that they're going to starve to death, that they have high infant mortality, which is true, they do. It's one of the problems with hunter-gatherer societies. But we also sometimes pushed it too far in the other direction. We see them as supermen. And one thing we need to keep in mind is that hunter-gatherers are human beings. Their desires and their processes and their fears and their needs are the same as you and I in a different environment. They're still humans. They make mistakes. There's good and there's bad. So they definitely had a more connective point to the earth. We are adapted as a species to the hunter-gatherer ethos, to the hunter-gatherer diet in a way. It's, one of the things, like we love fat and salt. It's because we are an evolutionary crave to get it back in a time when that was really rare. And it's very good for you when you get it rarely. But there is a certain thing to be said for being disconnected. We are cultural creatures. We are biological creatures, but one thing that sets us apart from other mammals is that we are a heavily societal, cultural species that adapts extremely well. We spread from a little group in Africa to conquer basically the entire world of nature, for better or worse. And there's a lot of worse in that too. But there's definitely something to be said with the idea that is our root. And the whole thing you mentioned too about having like a psychological well-being from being in nature. And I'm a full supporter of that. I'm a full believer in that. I know there are forest preschools in Santa Barbara that do that sort of thing and that same ideas. And one thing that does give me hope is I look at a lot of the youth culture today, the millennial, and I don't know what the next generation after millennial is, but I see more like what they call the dirtbag lifestyle, where they're trying their best to go back to, they do it living in vans, not in teepees, but they do it. They go from place to place and live more simply and connected in nature and feel good in nature.
So I just wanted to touch on your website, Leftwich, LEFTWICH, archaeology, leftwicharchaeology.com. So people can go there and find out more information about you and how you can work with development projects and sustainable land use and other things. Do you want to mention anything about that?
Sure. There's two kind of branches of archaeology, two career paths in archaeology. There's the academic world, which you typically think about with archaeologists working for museums and universities. However, in North America, the vast majority of us are employed in something called cultural resource management. And basically, we work with the same people that work with endangered species and wetlands and anti-pollution. We assess the impacts of a project, infrastructure, housing, whatever, to see if it's going to impact a significant archaeological site. A cultural resource is the language we use. And it is a business. It is a permitting consulting business. And I work with mainly the city and county. I've been doing it about 20 years now. It is not sort of the archaeology people think of. It's a lot more regulations and boilerplate reports. And, you do go into the field, but we're kind of what I call the business of finding nothing. Like you find something, the first thing you do is how do we avoid it? Not how do we investigate it? And we work very closely all over, especially in California, with Native communities, getting their opinions. What are their concerns when something happens near one of a sacred space, or unfortunately maybe a cemetery, or sites that were. So it is not sort of your traditional what you think of as scientific archaeology. We're still scientists, but we're more making sure things are protected than researched.
Got it. And you did your dissertation on hunter-gatherer decision-making. I'd love to get your point of view on this. So after I wrote Sedentary Nation, a doctor in town, Dr. Bill Gallivan, said, write one called The Aging Athlete. He said it's a new field in orthopedic medicine. So I started interviewing these athletes, high performance people. So that could be ex-military, ex-high school, college, and pro athletes, Broadway dancers, general contractors, anyone high performance physical. You mentioned injuries of repetition. And so what I found with these people is that they often risk everything. They put everything on the line for their team, for their career, and then they suffer oftentimes a breakdown in mind, body, or spirit, or all, because those are all interrelated. If you're trapped in a wheelchair, it could impact your mental stability and and make you depressed, etc. So I thought about these people who we hold out to be, like a modern warrior, and then I took that and I made a link back to ancient Sparta, and I talked about the warriors where you had to win the battle, win the war, and I find that there is a parallel between these athletes, these high performance people who risk everything in their physicality and mind for the victory. And then if you go back to hunter gatherers, you could find the same thing in terms of protection and raiding. And then if you go to a tribe of lions, so this is something that I put all together, and I'd love to hear what you think about this. In the tribe of lions, in the pride, there'll typically be two females who are the ones that take the big animal, the four-legged quadruped, down. And the other ones are all herding animals, almost always female. And they herd, and then the two tacklers are like the linebackers in football, and they do the tackling. And then if it's a really big one, the two females may grab the wildebeest, and then a male may get off of his duff and come over and jump on top of it and help out. But he's not doing the herding or the tackling typically. But the ones who suffer the most injury, of course, are those two tackling females. They're the ones who can get a hoof right in the face. They're the ones who can get the antler and they open up their stomach. And if they open up their stomach, there's a very strong likelihood that they will perish. And then the tribe or the pride will go on living. So maybe take me through the hunting and the high impact stuff of what I call modern athletes, and then link me into a hunter-gatherer tribe where they're either fighting and defending with the male leaders, the Braves, let's say, in an Ogallala Sioux tribe, or doing an attacking of an animal that's pretty worthy of defending itself. Maybe share a little bit on that.
I got two examples that quickly come to mind, and one thing is, so we think about, let's take a step back in time. And let's go back to Neanderthal, who a separate species from modern Homo sapiens. It does appear there's interbreeding and all that, but there are species of humans that no longer exist. One thing that's endemic when you start looking at the remains of Neanderthals is how badly damaged, especially the male skeletons, are. And they suffer traumas. Now there is education, a broken leg is not a death sentence. A lot of them survived and healed, which would require community support to do that. But one thing is that it's theorized their hunting technique was to take a spear and go charging in to a woolly mammoth or something like that. And yes, sometimes it worked. A lot of times, like the poor lion, they get gored, they get hurt, and it could be a life-changing event. And when you're talking about a group or a band, we're talking about early tribes. Band is more of a better political thing. You're talking a dozen people, maybe 20, and that's your village, and you lose one of your best hunters. That's a major blow to the sustainability of your village. One reason that Homo sapiens modern Homo sapiens basically replaced Neanderthals evolutionarily, as we were better cooperators. And so we have two examples of sort of semi-modern hunter-gatherer. What the first one would be, thinking of again the Kalahari, that's Southwest Africa, where say you're on a giraffe hunt, and it is not a brute force hunt. You find a giraffe, you have very skilled people, and you wound it. You stab it, you basically try to give a leg injury, and then you chase it until that animal almost basically dies of exhaustion. Human beings in those situations in good shape, natural shape, have incredible endurance. And as a community, they can track, they can wound, they can herd. They'll herd the giraffe into the trap of the person with the atlatl or the spear or the snare or whatever to injure it. That is a communal hunt, and they will take what they can, and that meat is then shared. The second thing I would think of is far more wasteful. We've heard, this whole idea of, we think about the Plains Native Americans, and the idea they use every part of the buffalo, and that's a myth. You can go to places in Canada. There's a famous archaeological site called Head Smashed Inn. It's in the Alberta Plains. I think it's maybe Saskatoon. I can't remember exactly, but they would take bison, a herd of them, and they would build blinds. They would build boulders on a line towards a cliff, and they would basically scare them into a stampede. And then you would drive sometimes 100 bison, because once the first ones try to stop, back behind them, they're pushing them right off. They don't know there's a cliff. So you could kill its community, and you're not risking anything yourself. You just drove 100 bison off a cliff, and you can pick your choice of meat. And we've got archaeological sites where there's hundreds of bison at the bottom of the cliff. A group of 30 people can only eat that much. So there is, it's not always this very clean. In terms of warfare and raiding, in a lot of hunter-gatherer societies, it does happen, but it is not as common as often depicted until you start getting sedentism. Territorial, because if you have, you can be a hunter-gatherer and still be sedentary. So you can be like the Chumash. You're on the coast of California. They were hunter-gatherers. They had an ample food supply with the coast, and some with acorns inland. And that was their protected territory. You tether yourself to a resource, basically. What happens is a domino effect. Once you tether yourself to a resource and you protect, and your group claims to own that resource, that means the lesser resources suddenly have to get claimed by other groups. So when one group becomes powerfully sedentary, it forces everybody else to start becoming more sedentary to protect what little resource patches are left. Now there's trading. There's all sorts of different levels of ownership of land. You can often usually ask permission, can I come hunt on your grounds? And usually it's yes, because then they'll say reciprocity, will let you'll let us next time we need to. But there's often really tight, dense patches that are protected. But that's what happens also with farming. When you start the Neolithic revolution that first happened 10, 11,000 years ago in the Middle East, you are then ascribing yourself to a certain area. So you look at the Mississippi Valley, long history of hunter-gatherers. They import corn from Mexico, comes up Mesoamerica. You grow vast amounts of corn. It's monocropping, but then you've got to protect your fields and raids. And warfare for a long time in central North America along the Mississippi Valley was endemic. I mean, tons and tons of horrific war injuries seen in the skeletal remains. Mm-hmm. So I think when you're thinking of big game hunting, and it's often prestige hunting, and we think about hunter-gatherers, and the first thing we think of is let's take down that bison or that deer or that elephant or whatever. But the bulk of the diet still is plants, and the bulk of the diet is some fish. And you look at early history, we're not above fighting buzzards off to scavenge. We're eating everything. That's one thing that archaeologists hated the paleo diet, because it's like we're adapted to this. No, we're adapted to anything we can get our hands on. That's why we survived as a species. We were omnivores, major omnivores. So a lot of what we think of hunting, especially for men in a lot of these societies, is prestige hunting. Native American society and bison and deer. You were a good hunter, you got prestige. It wasn't just sometimes about the food. That being said, the game hunted is extremely healthy and extremely needed. Those sources of protein and especially fat, as much as we vilify fat nowadays, it was crucial to survival. Without fat, you don't get these big brains. That was crucial in our development as a species, was eating lots of fat. You still need it in your diet, even if you're, a weightlifter or a healthier athlete. Sugar is a different thing. But the simple carbohydrates you loved when you found that berry patch.
So as far as the sustainable human, the sustainable band of people, and then these athletes whom I say that we attempt to get too much out of the athlete in too short of time with too little rest and too little mindfulness. So rather than building a balanced person like Tiger Woods, we build a super athlete who's so focused in one area. And now Tiger's body, even before his car injury, was already falling apart. Right. By the age of 30, he'd already had a handful of operations. By 40, I think he had 12 or 15. So he was a super workaholic, focusaholic, not a balanced individual. I do wish him all the best. I'm not critiquing his future by any chance, but he's not, in my opinion, a role model for a balanced person. And a lot of the athletes I talk to tell me that they wanted to be a balanced person, but their coaching went after them, and the pressure of their scholarship or their pro team or what have you, or the state finals, put so much pressure on them that they got caught up in it, and they had to win for the team and sacrifice for the team. But they had a lot of weekends in pain and agony, and then maybe taking anti-inflammatories or other substances and injections just to get back out there. Even when they were 17 or 20, as a young person, they were already, semi decrepit in terms of their overperformance and overindulgence on sacrificing themselves. Maybe mention how that mindset fits into some sort of a superhuman performance of former people like the farmers and the hunter-gatherers.
Sure, and I certainly echo what you say with the super athlete idea, and also one thing to add to that I remember, growing up to the 80s was the big drug scandals, cocaine and all that with the baseball players and basketball players, bands, people overdosing, because it was the pressure to survive, but it was also the pressure to release from being, you can't be on all the time. No one can. Putting into an evolutionary or hunter-gatherer standpoint, it's a little more difficult because you don't hunt all the time. You are hunting at need. You are hunting opportunistically. You're not going out every day. And so you are living, I think, as a hunter-gatherer, even as a super athlete. You're living a more balanced life as it is. It is a little hard because we tend to put our own cultural experiences and biases onto cultures where the family dynamic or whatever is completely foreign to what we would know. And what the needs, like, for example, in our sports culture, and I want to refer back to the San people, the Kalahari. They're a wonderful group because they were very heavily studied. And it happens a lot of Native Americans too. If you're a superstar athlete, if you're a Tom Brady, if you're a LeBron James, you are attracting that praise. It is not just you've earned a point where you're the best. You've got to keep up that level of the best, and you have to let everybody let you know you're the best. In a lot of hunter-gatherer societies, not 100%, but a lot, you have a more egalitarian ethos, meaning that if you are the best hunter in your band, in your village, everybody knows it. Everybody respects that. But as soon as you say that you're ostracized. That there is a strong pushback in a lot of these societies to keep modest. Like if you go out by yourself and kill a gazelle, and you want to bring that meat home, you are expected as the person who is the best hunter to take the smallest share. You are the person, basically everyone might say, oh, this is a great antelope. You say, no, it's not that big. I missed the big one. So there's a different societal pressure. There is a pressure to share in the community. And I think that is, again, an evolved state. When you are living with the same people, rarely coming in contact with others, and you're moving from place to place. You're related to most of them. I mean, there was intermarriage. You didn't want to marry within your group, but you would sometimes switch all bands. But this was your village. The person with the big ego was not appreciated. And I think there's a different push to tribe. Now, there were injuries, absolutely. And most, if you survive childhood, the most common death among a hunter-gatherer is typically what they call accident. They fall from a tree while getting honey. More than disease, it's an accident.
You didn't have a way to fix a broken leg in the 1500s if you were hunter-gatherer very easily, I would imagine.
Well, there were methods. People survived it. But if it's a compound fracture, you don't understand infection. Yeah. And when we talk about like hunter-gatherer societies having this, like you live to 45, life expectancy of 40 years. Statistically, that's true, but it's because it's skewed by extremely high 45, 50% child mortality. If you survive to being a teenager, your odds of surviving to 50 or 60 years of age are just about as high as they are today. Mm-hmm. You certainly had elderly people that lived in groups. And one thing, too, is that those elders are a lot more respected than we would say in our society. And a big reason is information didn't change. Technology didn't change at the same rate. That experience was valued differently. It wasn't an antiquated idea. How you knew how to hunt when you were 12 was still the same techniques at 65. But in terms of having this overabundance of stress, I don't see a comparison of people having that same stress level unless you're near starvation. Starvation is a major driver, and the hunter-gatherers weren't always well fed. Sometimes, yes, you'd have a good time, but you as a society sometimes would go 6-7 days, weeks without having food. And that would be a stressor. And I've got to do this. And then you take more risks. That's the drive. That's the driver more than individual success or locking in.
I happened to read a very pivotal book in my life in 2013. It was called The Heart of Everything That Is: The Untold Story of Red Cloud, the only Native American chief to win a war against the federal troops. So he didn't just win a battle, he won the war, Red Cloud's war. And in the book, it's amazing because he would go in as a retired person. He lived a long life for the 1800s, and he would go into the post office area, and either the postal person or someone in there would jot down everything he said. And he was in there frequently, and he had a memory where he remembered stuff from when he was 10 years old. And so here's a guy in his 70s recounting his life. And thankfully, somebody wrote that down. And one of the things he said, which might be different than the Kalahari tribes, the Sand people, is that there was a lot of ego in his tribe in the Oglala Sioux. And a couple of quick stories. One is he had a girlfriend when he was a young person, and they were in love. But because his mother was from the lineage of the political leaders, he was unable to marry somebody like his girlfriend and maintain a potential for becoming a chief one day. So when he decided to marry someone he didn't love, his girlfriend went out and committed suicide. She hung herself. So that was one thing. And another thing that he mentions is that he got really good at hunting. And when he would bring back a kill, and he would bring that to the political medicine man and the wellness medicine man of his tribe, that would give him a lot of favor, and that put him in the lineage to get the handoff so he could be next in line later. So there was a lot of ego and tit for tat, and maybe what I would call inequality in his particular tribe. Maybe you could comment on these.
Sure. So you're hitting on a very important point there. So when you think about hunter-gatherers and sort of ethos, there's this idea based on Aborigines and based on sort of forest tribes and polar tribes that you do have this idea of egalitarianism. It's not a perfect system, but there is a spectrum. And I've got a book that I really like, The Foraging Spectrum. It's by Robert Kelly. It is a great primer. There's detractors to it, like any academic book, but it's a great primer for understanding from archaeology standpoint the idea of hunter-gatherer societies. And one of the things he talks about in the foraging spectrum is we have to let go that there's these stereotypes of that. Kalahari is an example of sort of an egalitarian society. But you're right. If you look into it, a lot of it is environment. If you were like the Chumash, were not egalitarian. They were a chiefdom. They were political structures. And it's foreign to a lot of Western cultures, but a lot of indigenous groups have moieties and clans where your village might have 4 clans. There's very strict rules who you can marry and who you can't within that. And also which clans have certain role. This clan is our war tribe. This clan is our political group. This clan makes decisions on food. And as you get complex, you definitely do have warrior prestige. You have prestige for where you're trying to compete for a position. Often that comes when you have enough resources. You get that competition when not everybody has to farm to survive, and when everybody doesn't have to lock in onto food. You can have specialization. You can afford for the shaman, for example, to only be a shaman. He doesn't also have to be a hunter. He doesn't also have to harvest acorns or go pick gooseberries out of the fields. He doesn't have to raise squash. The chief can be a chief and deal with political matters and senses of trade. And so, but to get those positions requires you build up prestige. And there's also, for example, Papua New Guinea. It's one of the most culturally diverse places in the world, 800 languages on that little island, none of them related to each other. They grow a lot of yams, but it's a very prestige-oriented society. And they often would call them mochas. When someone's getting married or if someone's getting trying to ascend to a certain status, the point is to gather as much items as you can and then give them away. The more you give away, the bigger your status. The potlatch is a typical word we hear with Native American societies, kind of the same idea. And you can get control through again, skill. If you're the best warrior, then the other warriors are going to trust you more so they don't get killed. They'll take your advice. Oh, he killed 10 people in that raid. Well, let's do what he does. He came back. People that come back are the ones that become the leaders. So again, it's important not to stereotype that society. And you don't have to sue. I mean, they definitely had, again, they had guns, they had domesticated animals, they had horses. They were farmers at one point before the introduction of horses. The very complex tapestry that is Native American history. But you're absolutely right. There is definitely a prestige. You have, Sitting Bull. You have people that were great, like Geronimo, great warriors. Joseph Bryant with the Nez Perce, one of the greatest Native American leaders who finally gave up because his people were suffering too much to keep fighting. I will fight no more forever, like this famous quote. So you're getting on that. Like when you start talking about the warrior culture, then I see a better parallel with the athlete culture and putting yourself through a lot of physical trauma. The difference is athletes can keep preparing themselves in ways that you're looking 500 years ago, people couldn't prepare themselves that way. You blew an ACL or you blew a knee 1500, you weren't ever walking again regularly. Versus now, just in the last 20 years, an ACL tear used to be a career-ending injury. Now people seem to tear ACLs every year and come back 18 months later and be close to the same athlete. But there is that push. When you talk about warrior side, Sparta is one. The thing about the Mongols as being one of the fiercest, successful. You think of the Welsh bowmen, the English bowmen being some of the most successful of military groups. The Inca that in 100 years took over the spine of South America. The tribe was only around 90 years, but expanded for thousands of miles. That's a warrior culture. That's a stratified society. Now that's farming. That's you start getting specialization. You got peasants making food. That means you can have a professional army. And I think that's a lot of time when you're able to produce more food than you need, you're able to store food for the bad times. You're able to keep your food alive, like on the hoof, like the Mongols. Then you can start developing technologies for war, technologies for conquest. And it's a lot of times easier to take your neighbor's resource patch than develop your own.
If we talk about biochemistry, a light bulb just went off when you were talking about the warrior culture. I think not only was it it was not only mandated by the way people got pushed out of territories and into new territories, like a lot of the East Coast tribes and Northeast wound up much further west in the United States, from the 1500s through the end of the large bands of tribal people here. And one thing that I just came up with is we're infatuated as a culture with violence. So the MMA fighting, the boxing, the acting of the world wrestling type of thing. So what if the Ogallala Sioux had a choice between being farmer with some hunting and being passive versus, being more like the Apaches, raiding and warring and stealing horses? I mean, if you're talking about a 16-year-old person with testosterone, a male, and the girlfriend that this person has who wants to marry this great brave who brought her some new horses and great food and is going to be a chief someday, there's a lot of biochemistry that's firing and hormones releasing when you have it's like their version of the big football game or the big wrestling match for a high school in Nebraska. These Ogallala Sioux had that on a regular basis, maybe daily or weekly at some point, where there's this big movement by the braves to go out and attack and go steal some stuff. What do you think about that?
That's a very good point, but let's make sure we put this in context. When you're talking about what we know about the Sioux and what we know about the Apache, when you're talking about Geronimo and the Apache and the raids, you're talking about a culture that had already been devastated by the Spanish. You're talking about a culture whose life ways was already pushed to the absolute extreme margin by ravaged disease that killed 75% of the natives of this continent. Mm-hmm. Pushed into the margins and rounded up, massacred by Spanish and English and French who came in. So you're dealing also with a culture that is devastated and desperate and also very angry. So a lot of that aggression that you're talking about is not necessarily a biochemical, it's a reaction to an absolutely devastating of their culture. So I think there is a difference there. And you're talking about there is endemic war, especially in North America, not all groups, but there is endemic warfare that happened. One thing too is to also think about, people don't realize this, but in a lot of these cultures, like they're Cahokia. Cahokia it's a UNESCO World Site right across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. It was the largest city in North America for a long time. It would have been bigger than most cities in Europe at the time. Almost no one knows about it, but it was the Mississippi, the mound builders and all that. A lot of frustration. Or you think about the Mesoamerican. One thing these groups did have were not to try to avoid that early 20s aggression and to avoid, or late teens aggression and among men, and to help with things like prestige and get people moving. Without warfare, endemic warfare is exhausting. And endemic warfare, nobody, the wiser people realize this is not working, but that push is still there. The young buck idea, right, is that you would have games organized, massive ball courts, sometimes miles long, where you would have very violent games. They were endemic in Mexico. They were happening in South America. These games where you try to basically mixture of football, soccer, and basketball, where you try to put things through a stone hoop, a ball, and sometimes one score wins, and sometimes the losers all die. They get executed or sacrificed. But you have those all along the East Coast, and you definitely have this, this idea that you had the East Coast groups pushed or just devastated out. And the same thing in California, when the disease arrived before the Spanish did. Spanish got here already to a devastated population. Smallpox wiped out a lot of culture.
Was that from the trapping people from Europe, or how did that get here?
The Spanish, the earliest people that came, the Spanish were the first to bring it. Remember, the Spanish got the the New World first. The Vikings did, but in terms of European groups, the Spanish got here and immediately devastated the Taino of the Caribbean. That was the first thing. The first thing Columbus did was try to make slaves. You had massive importation, obviously, later of slaves from Africa. Obviously, we know about what happened in the United States, but Brazil had 4 times as many slaves come from Africa as the U.S. did. One reason they were brought in is because they were more resistant to old world diseases. And they wanted, the settler, they look at the Spanish when they came in first in Mexico, that disease ran through Mexico when De Soto came through the Southeast. And I can't remember the dates, but not in the late 1500s. He went through places that no European had ever set foot, but it was abandoned village after abandoned village after abandoned village. That it was just everybody had already been wiped out, mostly by smallpox, measles, other communicable diseases for which there was absolutely no immunity. So when we start thinking about behaviors of these groups, aggression, most of them, they're not the same behaviors you might have seen 100 years earlier. Desperation makes you angry. And I think that,
we have fear and anger are related. Fear and bad behavior are related. Even someone who's a billionaire, they have fear that they're going to die. They have fear that they're going to be taken over, that they're aging and they're not going to be as attractive. So fear permeates our system. One of the things I was thinking about, besides what you shared of these people were being pushed around and devastated, and of course the violence fits in as a normal part of behavior of that. But I'm going to try to bring this point to some way of speaking about it sensibly. That is that peace does not fire brain chemistry. Now, there's a way to be enlightened and enjoy the peace on a higher plane than hormonal biochemistry, the supercharged biochemistry. But what I'm thinking of as a simple person in the modern era, 2021, where we are today, there's a lot of draw of violence. So what are the things that fire our hormones? There's sex, there's fight, flight, and freeze of winning and fighting, like the neighborhood 12-year-old or 15-year-old. There's a lot of hormonal activity there. There's love. There's many things that fire our biochemistry, but in a time of peace where there is no violence and little fear, it seems that it's harder for our modern society to find things that fire the biochemistry. And since there's a lot of apathy in the world, you combine peace and apathy, and there could be this move towards violence. There could be a move towards internet porn or whatever it is for the human psyche. That might be a different conversation with someone who studies biochemistry, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on if any of that makes sense to you.
It does. And one thing that it's the adage that the death of one person's a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. Like we are not adapted to understand mass violence as a society, as a species. Like we witness it, we recognize the horror, but we have a hard time recognizing, picturing any number bigger than 100. Right? We hear 50 killed in a shootout, but then we hear millions detained of the Uyghurs in China, and like it's one's bigger than the other, right? And we can't figure it out. We can't process that. The other thing is you're right too, that violence is not new. And you look at stories, for example, of the Union soldiers post-Civil War. They were the big slaughterers. Our big Civil War heroes, Sherman and Sheridan and all that, were the big slaughterers of Native Americans. They needed to continue that, or it was just a way of...
They fired their bloodlust, and they were angry that lots of their friends and uncles and brothers got decapitated or lost a limb or died of gangrene. So there's a lot of anger, and
there's easy to dehumanize the other side. And that is how we get over it. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I've never been in war, so I want to this is an opinion. It's an armchair opinion, but traumatic stress disorder from hurting other people is a real thing. And I've got family that were Vietnam that are still suffering from it, watching not their friends and family, or their friends get killed, but watching villagers get massacred. that were completely innocent. Even though that's not their culture, they're human beings, they still connect. And you can read definitely accounts of ancient Greeks and all that, where the point where, the warfare is face to face. We're not pushing buttons from 1,000 miles away to kill somebody. You're using a knife and you're seeing the person die. That has a psyche effect. And the one way to deal with that is either to collapse psychologically or to steel yourself to where it doesn't bother you. And I don't think, again, if you're talking from an evolutionary perspective, and this is a slippery slope statement, I recognize that, but we are all originating from groups, from our bands that were usually no more than 24 people in size. And recognizing the death of someone like that is important. You can't fathom or you might come across maybe a whole village got massacred or died of a disease or whatever, and you can see that. But again, it's 20 people. We are not, I don't think we're programmed to follow our leader. It's not usually not in, you definitely have murders and stuff that happen, but when you have massacres, it's a chain of command usually. At least on a state level or war level, all throughout history. You look at Wounded Knee or Sand Creek with Native Americans, and you can look at it with Native Americans among Native Americans. There's massive slaughter pits, or the Aztecs had temples of skulls. And it's a way of you are reinstalling your supremacy through fear. Fear is primal. And you're reinstalling it because you're also fearful of what happens if you don't. What's the reprisal? Reprisals are reciprocal. Like, it goes on forever in a lot of societies. One reason that you could not have a united front when the Europeans invaded, especially, you had like the wars in Illinois, the Northwest Wars during the French and Indian War, all that kind of stuff, was people were trying to unify to fight the English, but no one could trust each other. All those generations of bloodlust, these are your enemy. The Kiowas your enemy. You can't trust them. Everyone got killed then. So I think there is a long history of violence, but there's also a long history of have that violence. You have to separate them, and you see it in, especially with British and French and especially Belgian rule of the Belgian Congo is one of the most horrific things that's ever happened in the history of the unbelievable. But the Mongols did it. The Mongols probably killed more than anybody. It was the fact that you were doing it to elicit fear, so you were at less risk next time. They wiped out whole civilizations, but oftentimes to do that, you have to be trained, like Sparta, like the Mongols, like whatever. Those aren't people. You're people. And it's no different than slaughtering a cow. And I think that is sort of the mindset that can happen to prevent freezing up from PTSD, because we are, again, our evolutionary biology is we can't watch someone in our band die, because that's a huge issue for us. We can't lose our best hunter. We can't lose our best warrior. We can't lose our medicine or our shaman, or those that connect to the spirits for us. We lose them, we're done. We don't know what to do. So I think it is, like, again, the one is the tragedy, the million statistic is very true, just based on who we are. We cannot think in those scales.
No. I have a way to bring us up into peace and sustainability and medicine and wellness. I'll see how this jives with you. I had a very close friend for a long time who was Cuban, and she told me that in her neighborhoods in Havana growing up, and the same thing for her mother's generation, same thing for her grandmother's generation, they had doctors and pharmacists who lived and worked in that district. And they got to know all of the locals. So there was no traveling to get to your HMO and no seeing different doctors every time. These people were part of the neighborhood, like the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. And so that's how and to this day, I believe it still exists. So they are handling things in a more knowledgeable way, knowing, like, did you take the prescription the last time? Are you a violent person? Are you a person who's balanced? how did you do over the last 20 years in your health? Are you a health and wellness person, or are you a person who drinks a lot? They got to know all these things about you instead of just going into a doctor today where you get perhaps a generic prognosis and a generic prescription because they have 3,000 people that come to that clinic, and they can't easily get to know someone over a long-term basis. Maybe take that part of Cuba in the 20th and 21st century and tell me how a medicine person in a tribe, you're familiar with California and the western part of the previous centuries here. Maybe tell us about medicine people and how they could get to know people and impart some wellness and medicine to that band of people.
So again, you would know in your group. Now, again, you're talking different levels of scale. If you're talking Chumash, you have various levels of healer. You're going to have those who are more, everybody knew a little bit type thing. Basically, like the comparison, like everyone's got home's got a first aid kit. You get you can put on a Band-Aid, you can deal with a wound. Usually if you get sick, you just stay home and you get better on your own. When you get to that next level and you start dealing with, say, a smaller scale society, and you look at some in California, that would be a lot of your more desert tribes, your Paiute, the Mono, versus the more complex Chumash, who are very powerful. And again, the Chumash wasn't a nation; it was just a collection of chiefdoms of villages. Is on a smaller scale, you had more direct access. You're absolutely right. They would know the person. And medicine I also know a fair amount about, I grew up among around the Cherokee reservation. And my grandfather was one of the first professors on Cherokee arts in there. So I know a little bit more about that with the medicine stuff, but it is the idea that specialist is a specialist, not just because they know medicine. I mean medicine, I mean herbs that can cure you, ways to pull out infection, looking at certain signs of things that cause internal stress, and knowing what can help them, because that's a learned skill that you would learn that from a predecessor. You would apprentice. But you also, those individuals would have in their cosmology, in their spiritual belief, connections with unseen spirits, unseen forces, unseen miasmas and gases. That there were things that would, even in old European stuff, you had the idea of vapors and, cover your mouth when you yawn so your soul doesn't escape, that kind of stuff. And again, it's not to mock it. It was very real in that society. And psychosomatic health is a very real thing. But the knowledge base with that is you go to that specialist because they have a spiritual connection to health that you don't understand. I don't understand how an MRI works. I trust that individual who put me in this big tube knows how that MRI works. And I think it's the same thing. You go in, you lay on a table, the person does things that might be strange to you, but you're having that level of trust. Now, again, that shaman, that healer, and whatever culture you want us to say it, and you could say America, but I think it's pretty universal for most levels of hunter-gatherer or indigenous societies. They will use altered states. The Kung, the Aborigines, basically will work themselves into a trance to try to communicate with whatever is making you sick. You trust them to do it. But that person also knows your history. They know your clan. They know who your family is. And they say, they're thinking about something like mental illness. Well, his father had something going on. We need to watch out for him. That might have something going on. They know that where you might have been. Did you eat? Was your child over in this area? Maybe he ate something poisonous. Because they know the environment, they know the land, and they can see these things. I'm not I love the fact that we have medical technology that can keep us alive longer. I love the fact that if I break a shoulder, I'm not going to die. Type things. But there is a separation with modern society between the healer and the person. I don't have a solution to that. The thing is, it's industrial, it's endemic. But the thing is, too, we're a massive population of people. And it's really hard that old country doctor who made house calls in the 50s only works if your town's 1,000 people to a well. And you're not dealing with all these massive insurance. Now, if you're rich enough, you can have a concierge doctor come to your house. But if you're, you're on SynCal Health here, if you're on Medi-Cal, that's not an option. So I think part of it is there's definitely an inequity in healthcare, which would not have existed in a less complex society. Now, the chiefs would have gotten prime attention, and the chief's family, but what you weren't necessarily excluded because of who you were, but because you couldn't offer. Now, you would try to pay them something. There was an exchange of something when you're dealing with these groups, unless you're at a very low band level. At the lowest band level, everybody was almost a shaman. Everybody knew how to take care of themselves, and you would help each other with that. The concept of Num around the Kalahari people, the San. It's very interesting documentaries where everyone goes into an altered state to help one sick person in the tribe. They're all trying to pull it out at once, the illness. But I mean, if we're talking about what society ills, especially say American ills, I mean, I think healthcare is right up there because we do have a lot of health problems. Environment, some, again, as you mentioned before, based on sedentism, some based on environmental factors. We have air pollution, water problems, and we're also can't be just that we have an increase in diagnosis. We know what things are more now than ever, and we live in a very advanced medical world. Not to discourage what a lot of Eastern medicine, there's certainly a lot in there too. It's a very, I don't just rely on the idea that Western medicine is supreme, but I am a believer in science. But I don't have a solution when you have 8-9 billion people. When, at the turn of the 1900s, I'm not even sure there was a billion people on the planet, and we're stabilizing population wise worldwide, or we're starting to. But I think that is the major driver. We can't communicate. And there's also, reminds me too, going back to what you said about violence, when you are a small group, a small town or whatever, it's hard to get away with bad behavior because everyone knows you did it. And you don't do stuff because of societal pressure. Now we have, I love the idea of anonymity. I don't like people, I like my privacy too, but it also means people can anonymously do really bad things. And continually be bad people because there's a guilty feeling of pleasure that kind of comes out of doing that. You can yell something out a window at somebody, yell something racist, and no one's going to punish you. So I think, the big difference you're talking about, like societals and behaviors, part of it is compared to more hunter-gatherer societies or whatever, we have more freedom to make choices, but there's also a few consequences to make those choices.
In the world buzzword of the last 20 years, sustainability, and I shouldn't just say 20 because Jacques Cousteau in the 70s, when he was already a seasoned man, he was probably in his 60s in the 1970s, something along those lines. He was talking about the coral reefs being at 10% of what they were as compared to when he was born. So that all happened from the early 1900s to 1970. We're down to 10% of the coral reef, and his big push was to save the oceans as best he could. And his main job was getting corporate funding to allow him to continue his research. And the reason he did the television films and to show that was to keep his name out there and to keep the corporations being able to advertise on his name. So he had to tie what he was doing in science and ecosystems to money and corporate world. So I'm going to ask you, in this busy corporate world or small business world, what could those people who are in charge and at the management levels of corporations and small businesses, what could they learn if they lived with a tribe of native people, let's say a tribe like the San in 2021? What could they learn from them?
That's a real hard question to answer. I understand what you're saying. It's a real, I think, apples and oranges comparison. I would hope they would learn a little bit about human connectivity. I think one of the biggest issues is when you're a major employer. Like I don't have permanent employees. I have people that help me from time to time, but I worked in the corporate world. I was one of the little cogs in the machine for a while. Is that you have and I don't know I don't have a solution to it, but I know it's the problem, is that you have a major disconnect. Now you're talking about disconnect from an environmental standpoint and sustainability, But I think before you can do that, you have to have a connect on the humanity level. So, you look at big companies like Amazon who have armies of employees, and you hear these horror stories about working in those warehouses. Is the fact that you are seeing people, which is your commodity, your energy. It's your calories as a company is your employees. It's not the money that you make. It's the people. That's your cells. I guess money is the calories that feed the cells. The cells are the people. You, from a health standpoint, like you said, you start neglecting your cells, the organization suffers. The organism suffers. And so I think the first lesson is, if you're going to stay with that group, is that you have a connection. Like if you're saying you're going to stay with a 20 band of Kalahari, you see that there is an important interaction. Everybody is important. And I don't have a solution, because when you're dealing with with millions of employees, you can't connect to them all individually. It's impossible. But you can, you got to be able to listen. If you sustain people, then it becomes easier to sustain the environment, because then you're listening. I am saddened. Like, I don't see a solution to sort of the corporate ethos, and how that, capitalist ethos and sustainability. I look at some countries like Singapore, who have done a tremendous job. They're not perfect, but balancing environment and culture. A lot of your Nordic countries have done a lot of, environment and economics and culture, and they're still capitalist. I think the competitive greed goes a long way towards that. The ideas of hyper billionaires having 90% of the wealth of the country, you lose accountability at that point. Again, I am out, as I'm a nature photographer. I go out, I see the world, and I've seen it change. I'm in my mid 40s. I've seen dramatic change going on. I don't know what else. We're starting to make slow progress on climate change, that could be reversed at any moment depending on political winds. But in terms of just like, what can you learn from us? Like, I don't think you take somebody like the Kalahari Kung, and you, on a global scale, that they could fathom that you could alter a landscape in that same way. Especially if you're taking one, maybe obviously modern, but if you're taking one 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and you're popping a modern CEO into a hunter-gatherer society, you can't explain what is going on. Like, you can't explain, like, oh, we just wiped out all the forest. That's not something that's feasibly possible. It's like someone saying to us, oh, I just captured the moon. So I think there's definitely a scale, but I think you have such a large population, until you find a way to level things out, but at least accept people as people and not numbers on a spreadsheet. I think that is the key.
I know it seems in the corporate world, there's a race towards innovation. Mm-hmm. There's a race to win. There's a race to gain market share, all of these things. But if you go to some places in Europe, like Holland and Austria, not so much all of Scandinavia, but parts of Scandinavia, because there's a lot of technology in Scandinavia where a race is evident. But in Austria, where I've lived several summers, you get the idea that, hey, my parents and my grandparents didn't have it too bad building these beautiful wooden homes with the timber that comes from our rainy climate and the good soil and the good mountains we have. And we all learned to do it. And we and the cousins and some of the neighbors will build this house that's going to last for a few hundred years. And there's my grandfather's barn he built in the 1840s, or great-grandfather built in the 1840s with stone and wood. And the wood is petrifying, but it's still holding up, and it doesn't look nice. Well, it sure does. So they've got some of these places have a different ethic on sustainability and what is beauty and what makes them enjoy having dinner together than this rush that some of the people in the other countries seem to have more of, which is more is better in the material world. And we've got to beat our opponents to the innovation, the Steve Jobs always innovating. Maybe the solution is to say, hey, when is enough, and when should we think more like Holland and Austria, and say that we want people to have good lives, including our own kids, if we're a corporate leader, and we want to have our ecosystem last and have a solution when oil is either poisoning the planet or we run out of oil. Maybe those are some of the things that would give these people a spark just as much as amassing more of certain things.
Well, three counters to that, or 3 points to that. I love the idea. And I think one difference is, versus I think some of these smaller European countries, if you're talking about the United States, is we don't have the same sense of place. We don't have the same sense of history. We're a pretty mobile society. We go where the jobs are. We go where it's fun to be. And so it's like you don't have, you see all these things about families trying to pass on their heirlooms to their children. The children don't want them.
Yeah.
And part of that is, they don't have that same connection. They didn't grow up in the same town as their grandparents grew up in, or, housing prices. They can't keep that stuff, right? They have to stay small and mobile because that's all they can afford to do. The second thing with that is, I kind of forgot. Sorry.
I was talking about more is more, and the innovation.
The innovation thing. The innovation is that's what it was. The innovation. So you're right in a way, like, I don't need to replace my iPhone every 2 years.
Every 8 months, if you go to some of the stores in town, they'll tell you that someone who's 18 years old and has a part-time job, every time there's a new update, they come in and they swap it out, and that's, it's $1,200 for an iPhone.
$1,200, and then you got to figure out what you can do with that old phone, which is, the electronic waste. But I think innovation is good in terms of focused innovation. And with all the warts on it, you look at someone like Elon Musk, at least he's pushing towards a more sustainable vehicle. You look at how incredible, when I worked corporate in the mid 2000s, we did a lot of the solar work that went out into the deserts. And I did a lot of the archaeology for those big solar facilities. You're driving to Vegas or you're driving out past San Diego. But solar technology has expanded by leaps and bounds. The efficiency of solar. How many new wind turbines have you seen? So I don't want to just throw out innovation as a negative. We're also doing much better at reaching out education-wise to kids through technology. At internet access for children, for school kids, no matter their income levels. I think there's that. One thing that does give me hope with all of that, you look at the Gates and the Musk and whatever that are sort of these technology drivers. A lot of them are trying to do things that make the world better. They're still capitalists with billions and billions and billions of dollars. But there is the younger generation is giving me a little more hope as sort of the boomer generation moves on, who can't quite see the damage done. It's hard to fathom what's beyond your own experience. The younger generation has a brighter idea of cultural inclusivity, and environmental sustainability goals. And I think, like Greta, these vocal champions who are coming out, and there is a massive youth push towards those calls. It matters to people now. And you're talking about, the warnings have been going off since at least the 80s for climate change, at least popularly. For other environmental disasters and water pollution, from the Santa Barbara oil spill here that lit off the environmental movement, basically.
1969.
Right.
Same year as Woodstock, and people from all over the United States, youth coming together at Woodstock.
Rachel Carson. You get these things that come out, and those were like the early voices, but it wasn't a widely accepting. We were still dumping Agent Orange on Vietnam, right? Like, we were still doing these massive, horrible things. We were poor. You can see the pictures of LA in the 70s and the 80s with the big clouds. Mm-hmm. And there is improvement, but the improvement has to come broadly. And it's fortunately, it's coming slowly, but it's coming as the generations replace each other. And you're looking at from sort of post-World War II, you can also see it on a societal level. We have this idea of, we have these racist great-grandfathers or grandfathers who didn't see themselves as racist, but a byproduct of their time. as society has gone on, they might have seen their great grandparents as horrible people in terms of that stuff. So I think there's a development, at least a positive development. Now, the thing that scares me with all this innovation and this happiness on the Western world is the strong push from the other side towards police states. Video cameras on every corner, controlling who sees what and all that, like the level of government surveillance because in order to have innovation, you also have to have dissent. And my bigger concern is those in power want to hold on to power, and they'll hurt whatever they got to hurt to do so. That, I think that's the biggest issue of technology. I'm a little fearful of AI. I'm way fearful of surveillance society, which I don't know how to stop that, because it's there before you realize it's there. But yeah, with those three, I think that those are the three factors. We don't have the sense of place in this country. Some people do. If you're living on the Navajo reservation, that's your home. You're living in sometimes some of these rural Alaska or whatever. You may not move out as much, but you're looking at the Midwest is completely emptying out of people. Everything's moving continually towards the coast. That's where the jobs are. That's people are more mobile for better weather. All those points. And we got, again, the housing situation in this country is hitting a major roadblock. But with that, innovation doesn't have to be bad. And I really like the youth. I really am impressed just by what, not everybody, obviously, but there's a caring. I have hope for that.
If I have two questions that relate to funding, so think of these before you answer. So the first one is you get $1 million, and that allows you to write a book and do the research and write a book. So what would that look like? And then number two, you're giving $100 million grant to go out and do something big, like a societal experiment. And what might that look like for you?
Well, the second one's almost a scary question. Like the societal experiment carries a lot of potential cobwebs when you say that. I in terms of a book that would change something, or in terms of a book that would,
something that you're passionate about that you've always wanted to research is also something I would love to
well,
hear.
I mean, if you're talking about a passion, and the one thing that I have for $1 million, that sounds about the right amount of money, is the idea of public space and public land. And I love that this country has so much of it, and protecting it and having us, like we're talked about back to the beginning of our conversation about reconnecting to nature, is to really put something together that convinces the public or informs the public, not just those who want to listen, not just preaching to the choir, about the value of the common, the value of the open space. And this is something, even from archaeology, it was real important. Like you look at the history of England, the idea of the common, of having a place that everybody could use. A lot of the civil wars and strife you had is when the king tried to take away the common as private land. I think that is a key point, because we can't all live in nature. We're too big, too many people. We some of us have to live in cities, but we need a place to go, whether that's something like Central Park in New York, or whether it is the great expanse of Utah, right? Where you have so much beautiful nature, but not only preserving it and important, but finding a way for people who otherwise don't have access to it because of societal issues, because of economics, to have access to that safely. I know there's an idea, like when you in a lot of neighborhoods, you put in a park, it becomes a crime scene. How many Law and Orders opened up with a dead jogger, type situation. But I think that is a passion of mine. If you're looking, because once you introduce people to that feeling that you get when you go outside and the fresh air and the birds and there's things alive and there's flowing water, that is how people who otherwise didn't see the importance of environmentalism experience environmentalism. This is what we're trying to say. You can't see it in National Geographic and understand it. It has to exist in the real. It's the same way that you see a mummy from Egypt in a museum versus going, like, that makes you want to go to Egypt and see something. That's why a lot of those, some countries like Egypt love putting their artifacts out in the world, because it brings people into Egypt. I think it's the same way you're going to have to do that with nature. You've got to protect and save these people, but not just save these places, but not just save it. Find ways to get people there sustainably, not just flood it.
It sounds like there's a potential to tie the $1 million idea and grant into the $100 million.
Sure.
So you do it in a bigger way.
Do it in a bigger way.
With some more science and sustainability and long-term planning. $100 million goes by very quickly once you have a bunch of smart people and some land use and some water rights and putting it all together.
Yeah, I think the biggest part is figuring out how to do a transportation network and then get people to places naturally. I mean, it's, again, like, I just got off the trail from a 60-mile backpack like last week, and it was exhausting, but it felt amazing to be back up in the Sierras before they all burned down this summer, to get up there for a while and relax. And one thing that I've, from my own personal life, is that one reason I kind of started my own business as a sole proprietor means I'm my own organization of my own organizer of my own time. It's a luxury. It's a privilege. I understand most people can't do that. But what that means is when I need a break and I need to go to the Grand Canyon or Joshua Tree in a week or 2 weeks, I can tell enough of my clients, hey, I'm going to be away for a while. I can be away from where I can go out and take pictures. I can go out and explore the world for bits of time. And I could spend easily months doing that. I have the advantage I can work remotely a little bit, and I can do my plan things out people can't do. But that's for me, that's the connector. I know how I feel, and I wasn't I wasn't always that way. When I was in grad school, I was in grad school, like I was in an office for hours and hours and hours, and I finished and I escaped, and my life changed. Like I'm what they call a recovering academic. I got out of, I stopped trying to be a professor, and decided what was, I still love the field and the passion of the archaeology, but what I love more was my own freedom to experience the world. So yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of answered both questions with the same topic. I think that's for me would be, once you see that, it may be, and not just natural sites, but there's important cultural sites, Gettysburg or the Tuskegee Institute or something like that. Not just have field trips like, you do in elementary school to the same place every year, because you don't pay attention. And again, not force it, but like have people to give the opportunity. A lot of people, like, I really admire, I didn't do it in my 20s, but I really admire the dirtbag culture, where people just kind of go from place to place. They're low impact. I don't know what post-COVID it's going to look like, but sort of the international backpacking culture. People take a year and travel. Europe does it all the time. The youth in Europe. That's
websites and YouTube channels about van living, and it's fascinating to listen to these people.
Yeah, and I meet a lot of them. My partner is an avid rock climber, so we go, multiple places a year for that. And then I'm a photographer. I do travel a lot for that. And we both love backpacking and hiking and doing all that. I don't, in my youth, I did a little bit of hunting. I'm not against it, but I don't do it anymore.
Share your website for your photography with us.
It's my name, Brent Leftwich, BrentLeftwich, photography.com. It's long, but it's last 15 years of journeys and travels that I've done. My favorite being I was in Antarctica a year and a half ago. And it's become, I'm an archaeologist by training. Last 5 years, a lot more of my life has been devoted to art and photography and narrative storytelling, what I call anthropological photography. I've actually given a lecture at UCSB to the anthropology department about 3 years ago on how to be a photographer and an anthropologist. So that is my main passion. Archaeology is my career. I'm slowly blending it away towards more for art.
So I'm going to mention to you and to any viewers that I'm always looking for fascinating, interesting, passionate people to do these podcasts with and to continue to learn from and experience their expertise through. So please reach out if anyone has a suggestion for me. They can go to Sifu, S-I-F-U, slim.com and connect me through that. And if they want to reach Brent Leftwich, tell us your two websites again, Brent.
It's a business website. So if you're looking for help with permitting, it's not the most interesting. It's just a business website, but it's Leftwich archaeology with the extra E in there. .com. If you just Google my name, Brent Leftwich, both of them come up pretty quickly. And then BrentLeftwichphotography.com, also on Instagram, which I post to every day almost with photography and stories.
Fantastic. So hang on with me while I close this out. So folks on YouTube, please like and please subscribe and please let us know your respectful comments below. We're happy to hear your points of view. And until we see again, I'm Sifu Slim with Brent Leftwich, and it's been an incredible little over an hour and 40 minutes where I've learned a ton and had a chance to share and hear his points of view. So I'm grateful for that, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.